The thermometer outside Jakob Andersen's shelter read 65 degrees below zero. The metal alcohol thermometer, one of only 3 in the Yukon territory that winter of 1898, hung from a post 30 feet from his dwelling. The mercury in standard thermometers had frozen solid days ago, useless as decorative glass. But alcohol kept flowing, kept measuring, kept telling the brutal truth about the cold. 65 below zero. Cold enough to freeze a man's breath before it left his mouth. Cold enough to shatter steel tools like glass. Cold enough that exposed skin would freeze in less than a minute. Cold enough that every other structure within 100 miles was burning firewood at a rate that would strip the forest bare by spring. But inside Jakob's shelter, buried beneath 4 feet of earth and sod, the temperature held steady at 42 degrees above zero. 107 degrees warmer than the killing cold outside. And his fire pit, the one everyone said he'd need to keep burning day and night, sat completely cold. No coals glowing, no smoke rising, no wood burning at all. He hadn't lit a fire in 3 days. Jakob wrapped his blanket tighter and smiled in the darkness of his earth-covered home. They'd called him crazy. They'd said his dirt roof would collapse and bury him. They'd predicted he'd freeze to death trying to prove some fool theory about the earth keeping him warm. They'd been so certain, so loud in their mockery. They'd been wrong. This is the story of how one man's radical departure from conventional shelter design, ridiculed by every experienced miner and frontiersman who saw it, became the key to surviving the coldest winter in recorded Yukon history. It's about understanding heat, earth, and the difference between building what everyone builds and building what actually works. And it's about the courage to dig down when everyone else is building up. Jakob Andersen was 34 years old when he arrived in the Yukon in the summer of 1897, part of the Great Stampede following the Klondike Gold Strike. But unlike most stampeders, Jakob wasn't a prospector. He was a builder. Specifically, he was a Norwegian immigrant who'd spent 10 years constructing root cellars, cold storage buildings, and underground structures throughout Minnesota and the Dakotas. He understood Earth in ways most people didn't. He knew that below the frost line, the ground maintained a relatively constant temperature year-round. He knew that Earth, properly banked, provided insulation that no amount of wood walls could match. He knew that the Scandinavian turf houses of his childhood, built half underground with thick sod roofs, had kept families comfortable through winters that killed those in wooden houses. But he also knew that no one in the Yukon was building this way. The gold rush had brought thousands of men north, and they were all building the same thing. Log cabins, small, square, wood-walled, structures with plank or split-log roofs, usually covered with a thin layer of sod for basic waterproofing. They followed the same design because it was fast, it was familiar, and it's what everyone knew how to build. Jakob watched them work through that summer of 1897, and he saw the flaw. These cabins, however well built, were essentially wooden boxes sitting on top of the permafrost. The wood provided some insulation, but not much. The thin sod roofs helped, but not enough. When winter came and the temperature dropped to 30, 40, 50 below zero, these cabins would require constant fires. Enormous amounts of firewood would be burned just to maintain barely livable temperatures. And firewood was already becoming scarce. Thousands of miners meant thousands of cabins, all burning wood continuously. The forest around Dawson City and the other mining camps was being decimated. Men were traveling farther and farther to find adequate timber, burning energy and time that should have gone to mining. There had to be a better way. Jakob's claim was on a hillside overlooking Bonanza Creek, a good location for placer mining, but a challenging one for building. Most miners would have built on the flat creek bottom, but Jakob saw opportunity in the slope. He could dig into the hillside, use the earth itself as insulation, and create a shelter that worked with the environment instead of fighting it. He began work in early August, and from the first day, his approach drew attention and skepticism. While other miners were cutting logs for walls, Jakob was digging. He excavated a space roughly 12 feet wide, 16 feet deep, and 8 feet high, cutting directly into the hillside.
The front of this excavation opened to the south, toward the winter sun. The back and sides were solid earth, reinforced with timber framing to prevent collapse. "Building yourself a grave?" asked Henry Sutton, who'd claimed the adjacent property. Sutton was a Canadian who'd been in the territory for 3 years, and he considered himself an expert on Yukon construction. "Building a shelter," Jakob replied, not pausing in his digging. "You're digging a hole in the ground. That's not a shelter, that's a pit. Come winter, the cold will settle into that hole like water. You'll freeze from the bottom up." Jakob had heard this before. Cold air sinks. Everyone knew that. A pit should be colder than the surrounding area. Conventional wisdom said to build up, not down. Get your shelter elevated, away from the cold that pools in low areas. But conventional wisdom didn't account for ground temperature. It didn't account for the insulation value of Earth. It didn't account for thermal mass. Jakob tried to explain. Below the frost line, the Earth stays at a constant temperature. Maybe 32 to 35 degrees, even in winter. If I build down into that earth, surround myself with it, I'm essentially inside a huge insulator that never gets colder than freezing, no matter what the air temperature does. Sutton shook his head. The ground is frozen solid up here. Permafrost goes down hundreds of feet. You're building inside ice, and ice is cold. This is basic sense. Permafrost is frozen, yes, but it's stable frozen. It doesn't get colder when the air gets colder. It stays at its freezing temperature. That's warmer than the air will be. "You'll freeze," Sutton said flatly, "and I'll be the one who has to dig your body out come spring." Other miners stopped by to watch the strange Norwegian digging his pit. The comments followed a predictable pattern: waste of time, waste of energy, fundamentally misunderstanding how cold works. Going to collapse and bury him, going to flood with groundwater, going to be an ice cave by December. Robert Mackenzie, a Scotsman with mining experience in Colorado and Montana, was particularly vocal. "I've built shelters in cold country, boy. I know what works. You need walls between you and the weather. You need a roof to shed snow. You need a fire to stay warm. What you're building is none of those things. It's a hole with delusions." "It's a shelter designed around heat retention," Jakob replied. "It's a grave you're digging yourself. Mark my words." But Jakob kept digging, and once the excavation was complete, his real innovation began to take shape. The walls of the excavation, solid earth held back by timber framing, formed 3 sides of his shelter. For the front wall, the side facing south, he built a conventional log wall with a door and 1 small window. This was the only wall exposed to the outside air, and it was the only one that needed traditional construction. The roof was where Jakob's design became truly unconventional. Instead of building a peaked roof to shed snow, he built an almost flat roof, sloped just slightly toward the front for water drainage. The structure consisted of large logs laid across the span, then smaller logs laid perpendicular, then a layer of birch bark for waterproofing, then the innovation that drew the most mockery: dirt, 4 feet of dirt, carefully placed and compacted. On top of that dirt, he planted sod. Thick sections of tundra grass and moss, root systems intact, laid like living shingles. By the time he finished in late September, his shelter had disappeared into the hillside. From a distance, it looked like a small door set into a grassy slope. The massive dirt roof, which had taken him 3 weeks to build and required moving literally tons of earth, was invisible under its blanket of sod. The mockery reached its peak when the roof was complete. 4 feet of dirt," Mackenzie announced to anyone who'd listen. "The fool has built 4 feet of dirt on top of his head. It'll collapse within a month. The weight alone will crush those roof timbers like kindling." "And if it doesn't collapse," Sutton added, "it'll be cold as a cellar. Colder because it's dug into frozen ground. He'll learn, probably the hard way."
A miner named Thomas Chen, who'd come from San Francisco and considered himself sophisticated, offered his analysis. "Earth is a conductor. The cold from the permafrost will conduct right through that dirt roof into his little cave. He's essentially built himself an underground freezer. Scientifically, it's completely backwards." Jakob listened to all of this and said nothing.
He'd learned that arguing was pointless. They were convinced by their preconceptions and their experience, which was considerable but limited to above-ground construction in less extreme cold. None of them had experience with earth-sheltered design. None of them understood thermal mass or the insulation value of thick earth layers. They knew how to build log cabins, and anything that wasn't a log cabin was obviously wrong. He would let the winter prove his point. Words wouldn't convince them. Survival would. Inside his shelter, Jakob built for comfort and efficiency. The floor was excavated another foot below the main level, filled with gravel for drainage, then covered with split logs. This raised wooden floor kept him off the cold earth and provided a stable, dry surface. The interior walls, the exposed earth faces, he covered with birch bark to prevent moisture and dirt from falling on his living space. His heating system, if it could be called that, was minimal. He built a small fire pit in the center of the space, directly under a chimney that ran up through the dirt roof to the surface. The chimney was carefully constructed from stacked stones and sealed with clay to prevent dirt from falling through. It vented smoke efficiently, but that was its only purpose. Jakob didn't plan to use it often. He also built a small entry tunnel, a 4-foot passage that created an airlock between the door and the main living space. This tunnel, also earth-walled and timber-framed, would prevent cold air from rushing directly into his shelter every time he opened the door. It added complexity to the design, but Jakob knew it would matter when the real cold arrived. His furniture was simple. A sleeping platform raised off the floor and built against the back wall, where the earth insulation was thickest. A small table and stool, shelves carved into the earth walls and lined with bark, storage for food, tools, and the modest supplies a single man needed. The space was dark, lit only by the small window and whatever candles or lamps he chose to burn. But dark and warm was better than bright and frozen. By early October, his shelter was complete and fully provisioned. He'd cut a supply of firewood, not the enormous stockpiles his neighbors were accumulating, but enough for cooking and occasional heating if needed. He'd laid in food supplies for winter. He'd prepared his mining equipment for the spring season. He was ready. The other miners, finishing their own cabins, viewed Jakob's completion with a mixture of pity and curiosity. His shelter looked nothing like theirs, where they had visible cabins, proud structures standing against the landscape. He had a hole in the ground covered with grass. Where they had peaked roofs designed to shed the heavy snow that would come, he had a flat dirt platform that would surely accumulate dangerous weight. Where they had conventional, proven design, he had an experiment that would almost certainly fail. Give him until December, Mackenzie predicted. When the real cold hits, he'll be begging for space in a proper cabin. If he survives that long, Sutton added darkly. October passed with gradually dropping temperatures. The first snows fell, light dustings that previewed what was coming. The miners settled into their cabins and began the routine that would define their winter. Fire in the morning, build it up, feed it throughout the day, bank it carefully at night, cut firewood whenever weather permitted, stack it, dry it, protect it from snow. The firewood routine became life, an endless cycle of cutting and burning. Jakob's routine was different. He woke in his dark shelter to temperatures that hovered around 40 degrees, regardless of what the outside air was doing. He needed no morning fire. He dressed, ate a cold breakfast, and went out to work his sluice boxes while weather permitted, or maintained his equipment when it didn't. In the evening, he might light a small fire for cooking, letting it burn for an hour or two, then allowing it to go out. The shelter retained enough warmth that he slept comfortably under a single blanket. His firewood consumption was minimal, a few sticks for cooking each day, perhaps a small warming fire once or twice a week. That was all. While his neighbors were burning through cords of wood weekly, Jakob's woodpile barely diminished. The other miners noticed. Questions began replacing mockery, though skepticism remained strong. "How are you staying warm?" Chen asked in mid-October, encountering Jakob at the creek. "The shelter holds heat well." "But where's the heat coming from? I haven't seen smoke from your chimney in days." "The earth," Jakob explained. The ground temperature is stable. The thick dirt roof and the earth walls insulate so well that the shelter naturally maintains a temperature close to the ground temperature. I don't need external heat. Chen frowned. The ground is frozen. Frozen is cold. Frozen is 32 degrees. That's cold for water, but it's warm compared to 50 below air temperature. When you're inside 4 feet of earth that's maintaining 32 degrees and separated from 50 below air by all that insulation, you end up with an interior that's much warmer than outside, warm enough to be comfortable. Chen remained skeptical but thoughtful. The evidence of Jakob's minimal wood burning was hard to dismiss. Something about his design was working, even if the mechanism wasn't clear. November brought the first real test. A cold snap drove temperatures down to 30 below zero for a week. The miners' cabins, for all their fires, struggled to maintain warmth. The thin log walls, the gaps between logs, the roofs that provided shelter from snow but little insulation. Cold found every weakness and exploited it. The miners burned wood at a ferocious rate and still shivered in their bunks. Jakob's shelter barely noticed the change. The outside temperature dropped from 10 above to 30 below, a 40-degree swing. His interior temperature dropped from 42 degrees to 38 degrees, a 4-degree change. The massive thermal mass of the earth roof and walls simply absorbed the exterior cold over such a large volume that the interior barely felt it. He lit a fire for cooking and to add a bit of extra warmth, but it was small and brief. 1 armload of wood lasted him 3 days. He was comfortable, well rested, spending no energy on the constant fire tending that consumed his neighbor's time and attention. Mackenzie noticed first. He'd been watching Jakob's chimney, waiting for the smoke that would signal the Norwegian had given up his foolish experiment and started heating properly. But the chimney rarely smoked. Mackenzie couldn't understand it. Finally, his curiosity overcame his pride. "I need to see inside your shelter," Mackenzie said bluntly one morning. "I need to understand what you're doing." Jakob nodded and led him through the entry tunnel into the main space. Mackenzie's eyes adjusted to the dim interior, and he looked around with an expression of growing surprise. The space was cool, but not cold. Comfortable enough that Jakob wasn't wearing heavy outer layers. No fire burned. The air was still and dry, not the damp cold that plagued poorly insulated structures. Mackenzie put his hand against the inner wall, the birch bark covering the earth. "It's not cold. The wall isn't cold. The earth is frozen, but it's stable at freezing temperature, and it's 4 to 6 feet thick. By the time the cold penetrates through that mass, it's been absorbed and dissipated. The interior never feels it directly." Mackenzie walked to the center of the space, looking up at the roof timbers that supported the massive weight above. This should have collapsed. The timbers are thick and well supported. The weight is distributed. And earth, when compacted, has tremendous structural strength. "But you're not burning wood." "I don't need to. Not much anyway. Small fires for cooking. Occasional fires if I want extra warmth. But the shelter maintains a livable temperature without any fire at all." Mackenzie was silent for a long moment, processing what he was seeing and what it meant. Finally, he said, "I've been building shelters for 20 years. I thought I knew what worked. This shouldn't work, but it does. It works because it's designed around heat retention rather than heat generation. Most shelters focus on making heat with fire. Mine focuses on keeping whatever heat exists from escaping. The earth does the work." Mackenzie left shaking his head, not in mockery this time, but in a kind of wonder. The news spread quickly. The Norwegian's dirt roof was actually working. His underground shelter wasn't freezing him. He was burning almost no firewood and staying warm. The impossible was happening, but the real test was still coming. December arrived, and with it came cold that redefined what these miners thought was possible. The temperature dropped to 40 below, then 45, then 50. It stayed there for days, then weeks. The weak sun barely cleared the horizon, providing light but no warmth. The forest became a frozen landscape where trees split with sounds like gunshots and metal shattered. The miners' cabins became desperate places. Fires burned continuously, enormous fires that consumed wood at rates that couldn't be sustained. Men formed partnerships, taking shifts to maintain fires through the night, because letting the fire die meant waking to potentially lethal cold. Despite their efforts, interior temperatures in the best-built cabins rarely rose above 10 or 15 degrees. Sleeping required piling on every blanket, every fur, every piece of cloth available. Firewood consumption became critical. The accessible forest was stripped bare. Men had to travel miles to find standing dead trees suitable for burning. The work was exhausting and dangerous in the extreme cold, but it was necessary. Without firewood, they would die. It was that simple. Jakob continued his minimal burning routine. His shelter temperature dropped slightly, down to about 35 degrees in the coldest periods, cool enough that he wore a sweater, warm enough that he was never in danger. He needed perhaps one fire every 3 days, small and brief, just to take the edge off and provide some comfort. His woodpile seemed infinite compared to his needs. By mid-December, other miners began asking if they could shelter with him. Their cabins were barely livable despite constant fires. They were exhausted from woodcutting and fire tending. They were running out of supplies. Jakob's shelter, designed for one person, couldn't accommodate multiple people long-term, but he allowed men to warm up, to rest, to recover from the brutal cold of their own shelters. If you're enjoying this story about forgotten survival wisdom and want to see more content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We're uncovering the techniques that kept people alive in conditions that would kill us today. Don't miss out. Subscribe now. Word of Jakob's shelter spread beyond the immediate mining camp. Other camps, other miners, heard about the man living in a hole in the ground, staying warm without firewood. Some traveled to see for themselves, skeptical but desperate for solutions to their own struggles with the cold. Jakob welcomed them, explained his design, offered to help anyone who wanted to build similar structures. But by December, it was too late. The ground was frozen too solid to excavate. The building season was over. Those who'd mocked his summer and autumn work were locked into their choices. They would survive the winter in their cabins, or they wouldn't. There was no changing shelters now. On December 28th, the thermometer read 58 below zero. That was cold enough to seem like a limit, a bottom beyond which temperature wouldn't drop. It wasn't. January proved colder still. The first week of January 1898 brought the cold that would become legendary. The temperature dropped to 60 below zero, then 62, then 65. It stayed at 65 below for 3 straight days. This was cold beyond most human experience, cold that had to be felt to be believed. Breathing hurt, exposed skin froze in seconds. Metal burned like fire when touched. The world became a hostile, alien landscape where humans simply did not belong. In the miners' cabins, survival became the only goal. Mining stopped. Prospecting stopped. Everything stopped except the desperate effort to stay alive. Fires roared continuously, consuming wood faster than seemed possible. Men burned furniture when firewood ran short. They burned tools. They burned anything that would combust. And still the cold penetrated. Still the cabins remained barely above freezing despite the infernos burning inside. 3 men died that week, frozen in their bunks despite fires burning 10 feet away. Found by friends who'd come to check on them. The cold had won. The inadequacy of their shelters had killed them. Jakob, in his earth-covered shelter, was barely aware the weather had changed. He knew it was colder because he'd checked the thermometer. 65 below, a number that seemed more like mathematics than weather, but inside his shelter, the temperature read 42 degrees. 42, the same temperature he'd had in November. The same temperature he'd had in October. The massive thermal mass of the earth roof, 4 feet thick and covered with insulating sod, simply absorbed the temperature change over such a huge volume that the interior never felt it. The earth walls, 6 feet thick in some places, provided a barrier that the cold couldn't penetrate on any time scale that mattered for human survival. The The shelter had reached a thermal equilibrium with the ground temperature, and nothing happening in the air above could change that without weeks or months of sustained cold. Jakob didn't light a fire for 3 days. Not because he was trying to prove a point, but because he didn't need one. The shelter was comfortable. Not warm in the sense of being heated, but comfortable, livable, safe. He slept well, ate normally, and spent his time reading by candlelight or working on small projects. Outside, the world was dying. Inside, life continued normally. On the 3rd day of 65 below temperature, Mackenzie came to Jacob's shelter. He looked gaunt and exhausted. His cabin partner had died the previous night despite their best efforts. Mackenzie had walked 3 miles in lethal cold to reach Jacob's door, driven by desperation and the knowledge that his own cabin was no longer safe. "Can I stay?" Mackenzie asked simply. "Of course." Mackenzie entered through the tunnel and felt the temperature change immediately. The transition from 65 below to 40 above was like moving from death to life. He stood in the main space, feeling the absence of wind, the stable, cool air, the remarkable fact that he wasn't in immediate danger of freezing. He began to cry. "I thought I knew cold," he said when he could speak. "I've been in mountains in winter. I've built shelters all over the West. I thought I knew what I was doing." "You built what everyone builds," Jakob said without judgment. "It works in moderate cold. This isn't moderate cold. My friend died last night. We had a fire going. Big fire. And he still froze." Mackenzie looked around the shelter again. "You haven't had a fire in days." "I don't see coals. There's no heat source. And yet this is warmer than my cabin with a fire that's burning through a cord of wood a day." The earth is the heat source. Well, not a source exactly, but a reservoir. The ground stores heat from summer, releases it slowly through winter. 4 feet of earth above us is a giant battery of thermal mass. The cold outside can't discharge that battery fast enough to matter. Mackenzie stayed for 2 days, recovering his strength and his will to continue. When he returned to his cabin, he was a changed man. He told everyone who would listen about Jacob's shelter. He described the warmth, the stability, the complete absence of fire. He became an evangelist for earth-sheltered design, converting through experience what mockery had never convinced him of. Other miners came to Jakob's shelter during those coldest weeks. Some stayed briefly, just long enough to recover from dangerous cold exposure. Others stayed longer, sheltering from particularly brutal nights. Jakob's single-occupancy shelter became a community refuge, proof that human beings could survive the worst the Arctic could deliver if they built intelligently. The winter of 1897 to 1898 was eventually documented as the coldest in Yukon history up to that time. The sustained period of 60 below and colder temperatures killed dozens of miners and prospectors. It forced the abandonment of several mining camps. It changed how people thought about survival in extreme northern climates. And it made Jakob Andersen's shelter famous. By February, when the temperature finally moderated to a relatively balmy 20 below, Jakob had become a sought-after consultant. Miners planning to stay another winter wanted to know how to build earth shelters. New arrivals, hearing about the cold of the previous months, wanted to avoid repeating others' mistakes. Jakob spent his evenings sketching designs, explaining principles, and teaching the concepts that had saved his life. The key insights he shared were straightforward but represented a complete reversal of conventional thinking. First, thermal mass matters more than most people realize. A thin-walled cabin has almost no thermal mass. It heats up quickly from a fire, but loses that heat just as quickly when the fire dies down. An earth-sheltered dwelling has enormous thermal mass. It heats up slowly, but it also cools down slowly. In extreme cold, this slow response time is an advantage. The structure simply doesn't respond to short-term temperature changes. Second, insulation value is about thickness and density. 4 feet of compacted earth provides insulation equivalent to many inches of the best modern materials. Not because earth is particularly insulating per inch, but because 4 feet of it represents such a massive barrier that heat transfer slows to nearly nothing. The cold simply can't penetrate through that much mass in any reasonable time frame. Third, building down has advantages over building up in permafrost regions. The ground below the seasonal frost line maintains a stable temperature. By building into that ground, surrounding yourself with that stable temperature, you create a shelter that's inherently warmer than the air. You're not fighting to heat air from 60 below to livable. You're maintaining a temperature that's already near freezing, which requires far less energy. Fourth, roof design matters more than wall design in extreme cold. Heat rises. The roof is where the greatest heat loss occurs in any shelter. By building a roof with 4 feet of earth and sod, Jakob had created an insulation layer so effective that interior heat essentially couldn't escape upward. This single design choice did more to enable his zero firewood survival than any other factor. Fifth, vapor barriers and moisture management are critical. Earth-sheltered homes could develop dangerous moisture problems if not properly designed. Jakob had addressed this with his birch bark inner lining, which prevented moisture from the earth from entering the living space, and with his well-drained floor, which prevented water accumulation. The dryness of the Arctic winter air helped, but the design details mattered. Sixth, orientation and solar gain, though minimal in Arctic winter, still mattered. Jakob's south-facing entrance and small window allowed what little solar heat was available to enter the shelter. In summer, that same orientation would warm the earth mass, storing heat that would be released slowly through the following winter. The shelter was designed to work with annual heat cycles, not just day-to-day weather. These principles, simple in retrospect, represented sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics and building science. Jakob hadn't learned them from books. He'd learned them from Norwegian building traditions that stretched back centuries, refined by generations of people surviving in cold climates. He'd adapted those traditions to the extreme conditions of the Yukon, and in doing so, he'd created something that worked better than he'd even anticipated. The social dynamics of Jakob's vindication are worth examining. He'd been mocked extensively, loudly, and with confident certainty. His critics weren't random skeptics. They were experienced frontiersmen who'd built shelters in cold climates. They had every reason to believe their knowledge was sound, and they were completely wrong. This wrongness didn't come from stupidity or laziness. It came from the limits of their experience. They'd built in cold climates, but not this cold. They'd used techniques that worked adequately in -20 or -30-degree weather. When faced with -65, those techniques failed catastrophically. They had no framework for understanding earth-sheltered design because it was outside their experience, so they dismissed it as obviously wrong. Jakob's vindication wasn't about proving he was smarter or better. It was about demonstrating that different conditions require different solutions, and that tradition, however valuable, can become a trap when conditions exceed its parameters. The miners who survived learned this lesson. Some of them, like Mackenzie, learned it profoundly enough to change their entire approach to northern living. The following summer, 1898, saw a building revolution in the Yukon camps. At least 30 earth-sheltered structures were built, all based on Jakob's design with various adaptations. Some were dug into hillsides like Jakob's. Others were built on flat ground with earth mounded over them. Some used stone walls instead of timber framing. Some incorporated root cellar spaces for food storage. The specific implementations varied, but the core principle remained. Thick earth insulation, massive thermal mass, minimal heating requirement. These second-generation earth shelters proved just as effective as Jakob's original. The winter of 1898 to 1899, while not as brutally cold as the previous winter, still saw extended periods below -40. The earth-sheltered miners burned a fraction of the firewood their cabin-dwelling neighbors consumed. They reported interior temperatures that remained stable regardless of external weather. They spent less time on survival and more time on their actual work of mining. The technique spread beyond the immediate Yukon. Miners returning to the States told stories about the Norwegian's dirt roof. Prospectors heading to Alaska carried descriptions of earth-sheltered design. The concept influenced building in cold climates throughout the North, though it never became the dominant approach. Earth shelters required more initial labor, more understanding of design principles, and more willingness to do something unconventional. Most builders still defaulted to conventional cabins. But for those who needed the best possible cold weather performance, who were willing to invest the effort, earth-sheltered design became the gold standard. Military outposts in Alaska experimented with the technique. Arctic researchers built earth-sheltered stations. Remote trappers and prospectors, working alone in extreme conditions, adopted Jakob's principles because their lives depended on efficient shelter. Jakob himself continued mining and building through 1899, then sold his claim and returned to Minnesota in 1900. He'd made modest money from mining, but he'd gained fame for his shelter design. Back in Minnesota, he established a business designing and building underground cold storage facilities, root cellars, and specialized earth-sheltered structures. His Yukon experience had given him knowledge that few others possessed, and that knowledge proved valuable in civilian applications. He also began writing about earth-sheltered design, publishing articles in agricultural journals, and building trade publications. His writing was technical but accessible, full of practical details and hard-won wisdom. He emphasized repeatedly that earth sheltering wasn't magic, it was physics. Anyone willing to understand the principles and do the work could build effectively. One of his articles, published in 1902, described the -65-degree test in detail. He included temperature measurements, design specifications, and honest assessments of what worked and what could be improved. The article's title was straightforward: Surviving Extreme Cold Without Fuel, Earth-Sheltered Design for Northern Climates. It became a reference document for builders working in Alaska and northern Canada for decades. Modern earth-sheltered architecture owes a debt to pioneers like Jakob, though the connection is rarely acknowledged. The passive house movement, with its emphasis on super insulation and minimal heating requirements, follows principles that Jakob demonstrated in 1897. The idea that a structure can maintain comfortable temperatures through design rather than continuous heating input, that seems innovative today, but it's what Jakob achieved over a century ago with dirt, sod, and careful thought. Contemporary architects designing for extreme climates still use earth berming and earth roofs for insulation. They use thermal mass and passive solar design. They orient buildings to minimize exposure to prevailing winds while maximizing solar gain. They build airlocks and vapor barriers, all techniques that Jakob employed, though with modern materials and engineering precision. The specific challenge Jakob faced, surviving -65 degrees with zero firewood, remains an extreme test case. Most modern cold climate buildings don't need to perform at that level because they have access to reliable heating fuel. But for off-grid situations, for emergency preparedness, for locations where fuel delivery is uncertain, Jakob's demonstration remains relevant. It proves that human survival in extreme cold is possible without continuous external energy input if the shelter is designed correctly. The mathematics of Jakob's shelter, calculated using modern building science, are impressive. 4 feet of compacted earth has an R value of approximately 16 to 20, depending on moisture content and density. His walls, being even thicker, would have provided R values of 25 to 30. In contrast, a typical log cabin wall might provide an R value of 8 to 10. The difference in heat retention is enormous. The thermal mass calculation is equally striking. 4 feet of earth over a 12 by 16 foot shelter represents roughly 250 cubic feet of earth, weighing approximately 20 tons. That mass, at a temperature of 32 degrees, stores an enormous amount of thermal energy relative to the frigid outside air. To cool that mass from 32 degrees to 20 below, the temperature the inside would need to reach to be dangerous would require removing heat energy equivalent to about 10 million BTUs. The rate at which cold can extract that heat through 4 feet of insulation is slow enough that it simply doesn't happen on timescales relevant to human survival. This is why Jakob's shelter maintained stable temperatures even as outside air dropped to 65 below. The thermal mass was so large and so well insulated that short-term temperature changes, even extreme ones, simply didn't penetrate. The shelter was thermally coupled to the annual ground temperature cycle, not the daily or weekly air temperature cycle. Before we continue with the rest of Jakob's story, if you're finding this information valuable and want to learn more about forgotten survival techniques, hit that subscribe button. These stories could save your life one day. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss future content. The construction challenges of earth-sheltered buildings shouldn't be understated. Jakob moved tons of earth by hand, using a shovel, wheelbarrow, and his own muscle. The excavation alone took 2 weeks of hard labor. The roof construction, laying timbers strong enough to support 4 feet of earth, required engineering knowledge and careful execution. The drainage details, the vapor barriers, the structural reinforcement, all these required attention and skill. This is why earth shelters remained a minority choice even after their effectiveness was proven. Building a log cabin was hard work, but it was familiar hard work that most men with basic tools could accomplish. Building an earth shelter required different skills, different thinking, and confidence that the massive dirt pile on your roof wouldn't collapse and kill you. Many builders simply weren't comfortable with those uncertainties. Jakob addressed these concerns in his later writing by providing detailed specifications. He calculated load requirements for roof timbers based on earth weight. He recommended specific construction sequences to ensure stability. He described drainage techniques to prevent water accumulation. He tried to make earth shelter construction as systematic and reliable as conventional building, but he also acknowledged that earth shelters weren't suitable for all situations. In areas without good drainage, where groundwater might flood an excavation, they were problematic. In areas with unstable soils that might collapse, they were dangerous. In areas where excavation was difficult due to rock or extremely dense permafrost, they were impractical. The technique had limits, and Jakob was honest about them. Where earth shelters worked best was in situations exactly like the Yukon. Cold climate, good drainage due to permafrost, stable soils that could be excavated and reinforced, and extreme temperatures that justified the additional construction effort. In those conditions, earth shelters provided performance that conventional construction couldn't match. The cultural resistance to underground living also played a role in limiting adoption. Many people simply didn't want to live in what felt like a cave, even a comfortable, dry, warm cave. The psychological association between underground spaces and burial, between darkness and depression, made some people uncomfortable regardless of the practical advantages. Jakob's shelter was dim, lit only by one small window and whatever lamps he chose to burn. For some personalities, that darkness would have been oppressive no matter how warm the space was. Jakob himself acknowledged this in his writing. He noted that earth shelters weren't for everyone, that some people needed light and visual connection to the outside world more than they needed optimal thermal performance. He suggested modifications like light tubes, larger windows in the front wall, and skylights through the earth roof as ways to bring more light into earth-sheltered spaces. These modifications reduced thermal performance somewhat, but made the spaces more psychologically comfortable for light-sensitive individuals. The legacy of Jakob's dirt roof extends beyond building technique into broader questions about innovation and expertise. The experts, the experienced miners who'd built in cold climates, were certain Jakob was wrong. They had evidence, their experience. They had logic, their understanding of how cold worked. They had confidence, the certainty that comes from years of doing something a certain way. And they were wrong. Not because they were stupid, but because their experience had limits they didn't recognize. They'd never encountered conditions extreme enough to reveal the inadequacy of their methods. When those conditions arrived, their expertise became a liability because it made them confident in techniques that weren't adequate. Jakob, as an outsider with different experiences and different knowledge base, could see possibilities they couldn't. His Norwegian background gave him familiarity with earth-sheltered design. His underground construction experience in Minnesota gave him practical skills in excavation and structural support. His willingness to be called crazy gave him freedom to try something radically different. This pattern, where the outsider with unconventional knowledge solves a problem that stumps the experts, appears repeatedly in innovation history. The experts know what's supposed to work. The outsider doesn't know the constraints, so they try things experts have already ruled out. Sometimes those things fail, confirming the expert's dismissal. Sometimes those things work, revealing that the expert's constraints were narrower than necessary. Jakob's vindication was complete and undeniable. He'd been mocked for his dirt roof. Then he'd survived -65 degrees with 0 firewood, while others died despite burning enormous amounts of wood. The evidence couldn't be argued with. The temperature measurements were objective. The firewood consumption was observable. The comfort levels were experienced by everyone who visited his shelter. This objective proof mattered. If the winter had been mild, if temperatures had stayed above -20, Jakob's shelter would have been adequate, but not dramatically superior. His critics could have maintained that conventional cabins were good enough, but the extreme cold made the difference between adequate and excellent into the difference between survival and death. In that context, Jakob's design wasn't just better, it was life-saving. The story spread far beyond the Yukon. Newspapers in the lower states picked up the tale of the Norwegian miner who'd survived the coldest winter on record without firewood. The stories were sometimes sensationalized, but they carried the core truth. Jakob Andersen had built differently, been mocked for it, and proven correct in the most extreme test possible. This narrative, the individual standing against conventional wisdom and being vindicated by results, resonated culturally. It fed into American ideals about innovation, independence, and the value of thinking differently. Jakob became a minor folk hero, the man who'd outsmarted the Arctic by thinking like his ancestors and working with the earth rather than fighting it. But Jakob himself remained modest about his accomplishment. In interviews and writings, he consistently emphasized that he hadn't invented anything. Earth-sheltered housing was ancient technology, used by cultures around the world for thousands of years. He'd simply adapted existing knowledge to a specific extreme situation. The innovation wasn't the concept, it was the application and the willingness to execute it when everyone said it wouldn't work. He also gave credit to the indigenous peoples of the North, noting that their winter dwellings, often partially underground and carefully insulated, reflected sophisticated understanding of cold weather survival. He'd learned from their examples, even as he adapted Scandinavian techniques. The successful solution came from combining knowledge from multiple sources, not
from lone genius. This humility, combined with his willingness to teach and share his knowledge, made Jakob a respected figure in northern building communities. He wasn't a secretive innovator hoarding proprietary techniques. He was an open-source pioneer, freely distributing information that could save lives. His articles, his consultations, his willingness to help anyone who asked, all reflected a belief that knowledge belonged to the community, not to individuals. By the time Jakob died in 1921, at age 57, earth-sheltered design had become an established, if uncommon, approach to cold climate building. His specific shelter in the Yukon had long since collapsed, the timber supports eventually failing under the massive weight they'd carried for years. But the concept lived on, adapted and evolved by hundreds of builders who'd learned from his example. The temperature measurement from that extreme cold snap, -65 outside and 42 inside with 0 firewood, remained a benchmark.
It represented what was possible with proper design, a target that demonstrated human beings weren't helpless against even the most extreme cold if they built intelligently. That measurement, 107 degrees of temperature difference maintained without external heating, stood as a testament to understanding and applying principles of physics to survival challenges. Modern survivalists and off-grid enthusiasts rediscovered Jakob's story in the late 20th century as interest in sustainable living and energy independence grew. His shelter represented zero-energy heating, the ultimate goal of passive house design. Builders looking to create resilient structures that could function without external power or fuel found inspiration in Jakob's demonstration that such performance was possible. Some modern builders have recreated Jakob's design using contemporary materials. Instead of timber framing, they use engineered lumber or steel. Instead of birch bark vapor barriers, they use modern membranes. Instead of hand-compacted earth, they use controlled backfill techniques. But the core concept remains: massive earth insulation, high thermal mass, minimal heating requirements. The modern versions perform even better than Jakob's original, but they follow the same principles he demonstrated in 1897. The cold that Jakob faced remains nearly unimaginable to most people. Minus 65 degrees Fahrenheit is about minus 54 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, the physics of matter changes. Water becomes rock hard, metal becomes brittle. Exposed skin freezes in a minute or less. Every breath hurts. The world becomes actively hostile to human life in ways that warm climate dwellers can barely conceptualize. That Jakob survived 3 days at that temperature without any fire, in comfort sufficient to sleep and function normally, represents a triumph of design over environment. He didn't conquer the cold. He
created a space where the cold couldn't reach him. He didn't fight the Arctic. He built a shelter that made the Arctic irrelevant. This achievement, mocked until proven, ridiculed until demonstrated, stands as one of the great examples of frontier innovation. Jakob Andersen's dirt roof, his underground shelter, his willingness to dig down when everyone said to build up, saved his life and taught principles that continue to save lives today. Everyone mocked his dirt roof. Then he survived minus 65 degrees with zero firewood. And the mockery turned to amazement. Then the amazement turned to imitation. Then the imitation turned to widespread adoption of earth-sheltered principles. That's how real innovation spreads. Not through argument or persuasion, but through results so undeniable that skepticism gives way to acceptance. Jakob's story, his shelter, and his survival remain a testament to the power of thinking differently, the value of learning from multiple traditions, and the importance of understanding principles rather than just following practices. The man who built a dirt roof when everyone built peaked roofs survived because he understood that insulation and thermal mass mattered more than tradition and convention. His shelter is gone. His name is barely remembered outside historical records. But his principles endure, embedded in every earth-sheltered building, every passive house design, every structure that seeks to maintain comfort through design rather than continuous energy input. Jakob Andersen dug a hole in the ground, covered it with 4 feet of dirt, and survived the coldest winter in Yukon history without firewood. That's not just a story. That's a lesson. And the lesson is this: when everyone says you're wrong, when everyone mocks your approach, when all the experts agree you're a fool, you still might be right. And if you are right, if your understanding of principles exceeds their understanding of practice, you'll survive while they struggle. You'll be comfortable while they suffer. You'll prove, through the undeniable evidence of your survival, that innovation requires the courage to ignore mockery and trust your knowledge. Jakob Andersen had that courage. His dirt roof stood as proof, and when the temperature dropped to 65 below zero, when the very air became lethal, his courage paid off. He was warm, he was safe, he was alive.
And he'd done it all with nothing more than earth, timber, and the willingness to dig down into the ground that everyone else was trying to build up from. That's the story. That's the lesson. That's why, more than a century later, we're still talking about the man with the dirt roof who survived the impossible by building the unthinkable. Everyone mocked him, then he survived. And in survival, he found vindication that no amount of argument could ever have provided.